Hello, everyone, and welcome to another segment of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, another event of the PBBI from California State University, Fresno. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are here to commemorate Pedro da Silveira. Pedro da Silveira is the topic for this evening's talk that we are bringing to you on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, again, PBBI from Fresno State, as part of our Cagajo Colloquium, community of writers of Azorean writers that live outside of the Azores, the Azorean diaspora, as part of also our Bruma publications, with our first publication to come out here, hopefully, in the next 3 to 4 months. That is the plan. Somewhere beginning of 2023. The collection of folk tales by Professor Manuel Costa Fontes, Portuguese folk tales in California. It is already in the works, and also, of course, these events, the PBBI Fresno State lecture series and our conference series for the fall of 2022 have, of course, the sponsorship, and we thank the Luso American Development Foundation that is flagged from Lisbon, Portugal. Thanks to those of you who are joining us here. Thanks to those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live. Thanks to the, I believe, 32 or 33 groups on Facebook that have agreed to carry us live as well. We appreciate your cooperation as we try to bring these talks that are still continuing to be online. We will have one event in person on September the 29th. So put that down on your calendar at Fresno State, those of you who are local from the Central Valley, anywhere, of course, from Merced to Tulare, Visalia, anywhere that you can drive and want to drive, even longer than that, but anywhere within an hour and 10-minute drive. Certainly, it is worth being at our in-person event, which will be with a poet, which will have also some surprises, and we'll be talking about that extensively through our social media outreach. So that will be September 29th. We have another in-person event that will be occurring on November the 2nd. So 2 in-person events this semester at Fresno State. And then, of course, we have lots of events, over 12 different events that we'll be putting on until December, mid-December, that will be online, such as this one. So today we will be talking, and I will be boring you, hopefully not too bad. So thank you all for joining us, with Pedro da Silveira, who I had the pleasure of meeting, who I had the pleasure of attending a few events with, who had the pleasure of attending an event at Casa dos Açores in Lisbon in his honor. I was one of 4 writers from the diaspora invited for that honor, and Pedro and I became friends. Obviously, we were very, there was a bit of difference in age. I'm 63, and Pedro yesterday would have been 100. He died, unfortunately, in 2003. I did meet him in the about mid-90s, so about 94 or so. And I knew him until he died. So I knew him for about 7 years or so. As far as meeting and talking to him, I've been a reader of his work and his poetry since I'm in my late 20s anyway. So a little bit about Pedro da Silveira and his centennial. These are his parents, Pedro da Silveira and Maria Teresa da Silveira, from the beautiful island of Flores, which we'll have some pictures to share with you. And here is a picture of Pedro da Silveira. His full name is Pedro Laureano Mendonça da Silveira. He was born on September 5th of 1922 in the parish, the Freguesia of Feijão Grande, and he died in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, on the 13th day of April of 2003. Actually, just about a year after he visited California. He was in California twice, once for a conference in the 80s at UC Santa Barbara, and then he came back about almost 20 years later, I think actually a little bit over 20 years later, for the symposium Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage in Tulare. And I had met him before. I had been with him at a couple different conferences before that. But here in the Central Valley is where Pedro and I had the opportunity of spending a lot of time. He was here for the symposium. The symposium was a 4.5-day event. He stayed a little over a week. He came about a day and a half or so before the event. He went up to Berkeley and San Francisco for visits for a day and a half or so. And then he came back and stayed in Tulare for another almost 3 days. And I took actually 2 of those days off from teaching and to spend with Pedro and learn a lot about the world, a lot about literature, because Pedro was a total encyclopedia. So he's better known as just Pedro da Silveira. He's a poet, a translator, a literary critic, a researcher with extensive collaboration in periodicals and magazines. He wrote a lot for newspapers and for literary magazines. He was on the editorial board of the magazine Seara Nova until 1974. Collaborated on issues 40 and 47th of the magazine Mundo Literário, Literary World, from 1946 to 1948, and is the author of several works of poetry and literary reviews, debuting with a book called A Ilha e o Mundo, The Island and the World, in 1953. This is the area of Feijão Grande, where Pedro was born and where he lived a few years of his life. He is the author of 2 anthologies of Azorean poets, the first of which has a preface in which he autonomizes the literature of the archipelago in relationship to all other literatures of the Lusophone expression, and certainly to the literature of mainland Portugal. And this was very, very important, because it was in this anthology that Pedro really took on the idea that, yes, there is an Azorean literature. It is different than mainland Portugal literature, and he laid it out in several pages, intellectually honest and very well done. And that's a preface to that book, which hopefully one day will be translated to English, is really a course in Azorean literature. He was part of the management commission of the National Library of Lisbon, from which he retired as the director of Service of Research and Cultural Activities. So Pedro, after his initial few years in the native parish of Feijão Grande, as you can see, an idyllic place, a beautiful place in the west coast of the island of Flores, during his years in elementary education, at that time you would only go to the 4th grade, he demonstrated his intelligence and interest in letters. And then he left for the island of Terceira, the island where he completed his basic education and came into contact with a relevant corpus of literature and literary figures. He was also in the seminary, as many folks of his age that couldn't afford an education did. In 1945, he moved to Ponta Delgada in the island of São Miguel, where he joined the intellectual group that was formed around a newspaper that was called A Ilha, the island, another picture of Feijão Grande in the beautiful island of Flores. So the newspaper was called A Ilha. It was a newspaper that had lots of cultural activity, and Pedro collaborated immensely. In 1951, basically at almost 30 years old, Pedro moved to Lisbon, where he would spend the rest of his life until he died in 2003 at the age of 81. And Pedro, of course, first in Lisbon, he began to work as a pharmaceutical representative. At the same time, he also began a path of study and historical literary research that would lead him in 1982 to become an employee of the National Library, from which he retired as director of the Services of Research and Cultural Activities. Throughout his intellectual life and his professional career, he devoted himself to literary criticism. He devoted himself to translation, to poetic creation, to research into the Azorean history and ethnography, with opinions that were not very conformist. I mean, he went against the grain a lot, including the defense of a single municipality for his native island. That was very, very, very controversial. And he was an uncomfortable voice at times, generally unloved by the established powers, all of the good things that make you a great poet. He was one of the promoters of the Azorean Encyclopedia, a project that he embraced with great enthusiasm. He also participated in multiple studies related to Azorean culture, and especially to the history and the ethnography of the beautiful island of Flores. This that you were seeing here is actually something that's going to happen, as those of you who can read Portuguese or cannot, but of course it can figure out what it's saying there. There is going to be an event there's been a multiple of events this last year, and a few events will continue to commemorate the centennial of Pedro da Silveira. That's wonderful, including a wonderful event on the 5th in his island of Flores. But this is just basically an event that will be happening with the University of the Azores and the Regional Library and Archive in Ponta Delgada. It is called Pedro da Silveira, Faces de you-Pedro Cultural. And I have the honor of being one of the guest speakers, keynote speakers, and but that's not the important part. The important part is it shows here the three major books, although there were others, of Pedro da Silveira, some of the things that he had published. He published many books, and the first one that I mentioned, the Poesia Açoriana, as you see there on your left, and Pedro da Silveira, right there on your left, Antologia, the anthology, and with that wonderful introduction of several pages, but very, very well done. He has a book called Mesa de Amigos, a kind of a table for friends, and it is his work of translations, literally dozens and dozens of poets from Italian, from French, from other languages, from Chinese through translations that were done from Chinese to some of the Romance languages and then into Portuguese. So it is a wonderful book, and you learn a lot about Pedro by also the works that he chose to translate. You learn a lot about an intellectual figure, especially a poet, by the works that he or she choose to translate. And so Mesa de Amigos, by reading the poetry that he translated, even though one might not be familiar with all the works of those poets, it gives you great insight into those poets, but a greater insight into Pedro da Silveira. And then the one there in the middle, Fui ao mar buscar laranjas, picking oranges from the sea, which is a great metaphor, is basically a collection of a lot of his works that were published, and that he published himself. And then there's a second edition that was done just a couple of years ago, with a wonderful preface by poet Urbano Betancourt. So Pedro da Silveira's poetic work really began with the work Ilha e o Mundo, the island and the world, that was published in go back here. That was published in 1953. Then he followed with another book of poetry in 1962, Sinais de Oeste, and continued with Coreografias in 1985, Poemas Ausentes in 1999. He also published the first volume of Fui ao mar buscar laranjas, this one right here, there in the middle, a collection of 20 unpublished poems written between 1942 and 1946, which was given the subtitle Primeira Voz, assuming to be one of his first poetic productions. According to, and I will quote from Urbano Betancourt about his work of poetry, and I quote from Urbano's intro, in Pedro da Silveira, the fidelity to the island, the poetic response to its insistent call gave us to know and gives us the knowledge, I should say, of the small insular world, its events on a reduced scale, not less important from the point of view of affection and human relationship. But this did not annul the sense of travel, the openness to new spaces and new writings in a healthy dynamic between an interior and what's exterior, a sign of naturally restless spirit, eager for knowledge, always ready to seize the slightest chance that would allow him to get in touch with the other side, a fact even more relevant in times of scarce and difficult communications. In 1990, on August the 21st of 1990, he was awarded the rank of Comendador, Ordem de Mérito, by the Portuguese government. Unfortunately, something happened here that I'd like to mention. I think it's important. It happens, unfortunately, too many times in intellectual circles and amongst sometimes writers and poets and artists in general. And that is that very, very recent, as with the commemoration of the centennial was basically kicking off October 9th of 2021, so just about a year ago almost. Expresso, which is a major newspaper in the mainland Portugal, one of Portugal's premier newspapers, defamed Pedro da Silveira, and it was defamed by journalist António Valdemar, who should have known better, and who committed one of the greatest gaffes in the history of modern journalism in Portugal, accusing Pedro da Silveira of having been an informer for the International State and Defense Police, which was the PIDE, the secret police of Salazar in Brazil. A broad movement of writers, historians, and friends of Silveira demanded the retraction of the newspaper and the journalists, presenting solid evidence that the accusation was unfounded. And I was really dumbfounded when I saw this, because Pedro and I, as I said, spent a total of about almost 4 days here in the central San Joaquin Valley just a year before his death, and he was very lucid and still had all of his wits, and we spoke about his work that he had done, and we all knew that he had done against Salazar, against the dictatorial regime. So on October 13th, a few days later, the Expresso newspaper and Valdemar published a statement acknowledging the complete inaccuracy of the article and retracting their professional misconduct, which was a good thing that happened, but still it left a stain, an unnecessary stain, and an untruthful one. When we look at Pedro's work, and again, here is the picture of Poesia Açoriana, the anthology that includes dozens and dozens of poets from the Azores from different time frames, and that wonderful preface. Here is the Poesia Reunida, and of the various books in Fui ao Mar Buscar Laranjas. And here is a better picture of the Mesa de Amigos, and again, that is his work of the poets that he translated. With this beautiful picture of Flores, I'd like to quote from Reis Leite. José Guilherme Reis Leite is one of our premier historians in the archipelago of the Azores, and was a member of parliament, was a member of government of the first regional governments of the Azores, was president of the parliament of the regional assembly, and again, as I said, is one of the Azores' most respected historians. And quoting Reis Leite, again, a quote from him: "The taste of Azorianness, the understanding that regional and universal are not antagonisms, and the interpretation of Azorian history as a political and cultural colonialism resulting from Portuguese imperialism. Without keeping these options in mind, it would be very difficult to understand Pedro da Silveira's cultural message." Indeed, Pedro was adamant, although he lived in Lisbon the majority of his life. He was, and here he is at a later age, as you can see there on the left, on the right, his card as member of Casa dos Açores, one of the first members of Casa dos Açores in the beautiful city of Lisbon. But Pedro had no Pedro had no qualms with talking about those issues, talking about the issue of abandonment of the islands by Portugal, not just in the Salazar regime, obviously that happened, but before the Salazar regime, and of course during the time that Portugal was a monarchy. If we look at Pedro da Silveira's work, and starting with his poetic creation, there are lots of poems. There are lots of poems that are indicative of the Azorean spirit, of the Azoreanness, of this understanding that you can be a real good regional poet by being a universal poet. If you're a good poet in the Azores, that means you're a good poet elsewhere in the world. And sometimes people feel that one should only stick to these regional themes, but these regional themes are also universal themes, and they're important for all folks in all walks of life. Let me just give you a little bit of Pedro da Silveira's poetry, because that's what we're here to commemorate after that short, maybe for you rather long, intro and visit to his life, and some of what folks have said about him. And I have a few other quotes from some other folks that have written about him, because there's lots of people that have written about Pedro da Silveira, and lately a lot more, and hopefully all of these works that are being written about him or said about him will be published, maybe in a book to commemorate 101 years. Who knows? We'll see if that happens. There's a couple more pictures of Pedro da Silveira again in his later years. And this is what was done in the as a way to commemorate the centennial in the home that he was born. Pedro da Silveira nasceu nesta casa, was born on this home, on the date of September 5th of 1922. And as it was said there, this was a tribute by the Câmara Municipal das Lajes, the city hall in the municipality of Lajes das Flores, the beginning of the centennial celebration. And as it was said, he died in Lisbon in 2003, a poet, a historian of literature, and a historian of the Azores in many ways, and a translator as well. One of the poems that I've translated, I'm actually working on a book, and I will go back here, but I'd like to share that with you right now, which is, let me just go back here. This book right here. So it's called, it's just in the beginning stages. I only have about 10 poems maybe translated. I'm hoping to have a total of about 40, and that really show the Azoreanness in Pedro da Silveira's poetry. And more than that, it shows how the importance that Pedro put on immigration. And that's where my talk will continue next. So Pedro really knew immigration. His family, his grandfather, his great uncles, his father. There was lots and lots of immigration in his family, as there were in many families of the Azores, certain islands, obviously more than others, and certainly in the beautiful island of Flores. And so I'm taking a line from one of his poems and translating it, called Pathways of Land and Sea, Selected Poems of Pedro da Silveira, is a book that I hope to have it published in about a year or so. And then at that time, of course, it will include some of these poems that I'd like to share with you right now. And so one of the poems is called History, and that's the one that Heislate was referring to. And it's been said throughout times that sometimes poetry is a lot more truthful than history. And indeed, in history, obviously, there are sometimes competing narratives. And poetry, sometimes because it's poetry and because it is have to worry about the reality of history, is a lot more real. So the poem is called History, História in Portuguese, and it is by Pedro da Silveira. And let me share it with you, the translation. Poem tasting of blood in my mouth. The history of anguish and unreleased rages, in our eternal history of renouncing life, waiting for heaven. Dark history that the old man brought of the elders of bygone days. Tales of grantees and captains, of Algerian pirates and English corsairs, stealing and burning the blood of the people. Poem in my flesh that my grandparents left me. Cries of revolt, not even sketched. Tears of hunger, of all hungers, wept hour by hour for so many centuries. Tears of the people. Poem made of hopes and of distances, smelling like salt. Our brothers who have gone to strange worlds of strange languages, they took gold in the sand of the rivers. They rented their arms on the ranches, in the factories, in the ports. The sweat of our people fertilizing the land of the San Joaquin Valley. Our brothers erected towns and cities in a foreign homeland and cried homesickness for the islands left beyond the mountains and the valleys in the middle of the sea. Homesickness for the people. Poem of those who didn't leave in the boats of immigration. To be born and to die between cliffs and open sea, nostalgic eyes gazing at the dock, waiting for the boats that will take us away. Hoes digging the land of the islands, the salty wind eating the sweat and hope of the people of the islands. Dreams of the people. Rise up, poem, rise up and shout, frightening away shadows and silences. Rise up, song of my people, crushed with hopes and crushed with the world. So a poem that tells a lot about what it's like to be an Azorean, even though the Azores are different today than they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or obviously even when Pedro was writing this poem about 65, 70 years ago. The Azores have changed immensely. But as you can see in that poem, Pedro incorporates into the history of the Azores the Azorean diaspora. He incorporates into the history of the Azores the folks that gave their land and gave their hands and their sweat and tears in the San Joaquin Valley. The San Joaquin Valley in particular, California is all over his poetry, but there are other places, but California in particular. And in particular, the San Joaquin Valley is all over the poetry of Pedro da Silveira. Pedro has had contact with the immigration, as I said, through his family, but many other poets did as well, and some of them chose to take a poem here and there, but not really spend as Pedro did a lot of poetry, a lot of effort in incorporating the Azorianness beyond the Azores in his poetry, as a way to say that the Azores are not just those 9 islands. The Azores are the 1,000 islands of the Azorean diaspora, as Rui Faria, president of the Azorean Immigrants Association and director of the Azorean Immigrant Museum in Ribeira Grande, has said before, and I wholeheartedly agree. Pedro also wrote, and as you can hear, another poem that I translated I'd like to share with you about those who stayed, but always within them, there was something about leaving. There was something about going somewhere. And so the poem is called For You Who Stay Still. For you who stay still, looking at the ship that loses itself in the pit. And then you bow your head to the land, and from it retrieve the bread with a taste of dead dreams. For you, dreamer of journeys that you will never make, and the fertile lands irrigated into all horizons, and cities where life isn't this repetition of the same thing every single day. For you, who wanted to be a rancher, a prospector of gold, a laborer in factories, in canneries, one day you would return to the old country, dazzling everyone with stories of what you saw, and you would bring pocket knives and overalls for everyone, and the promise of a Holy Ghost festa for the entire village, with the certainty of ownership of the world in your eyes. You, who maybe haven't even crossed the canal until the first island where the scheduled ship stops. For you, brother, farmer and sailor from my island, the hope of my song. So again, a wonderful poem from my perspective that basically talks of Pedro da Silveira, and talks about immigration, and talks even of those who never left, and who, of course, probably wanted to leave. Some had the courage to, some did not want to. And it's not just the courage, it's also folks believe that they should stay and build, as he put it, their own fortune within their own country, as all people have the right to do. This is just a few pictures I'd like to share with you. And this is of the event that actually happened in the beautiful island of Flores. Thanks, the pictures are not mine. Their pictures are of another awesome Florentine lady and the poet herself, which is Gabriela Silva, who has visited California a few times and was part of the symposium Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage. And here you see some of the folks who were part of the commemoration of the centennial of Pedro da Silveira in his hometown, in his home municipality in the beautiful island of Flores. There was also an exhibition that was done, and very well done, about Pedro da Silveira, which we would love to bring it to the States and have it, if possible, at Fresno State, because Pedro has a very, very strong connection to the San Joaquin Valley, as I said. And I actually, later on in the year, will do another talk about Pedro Silveira and talk to you a little bit about some of the stories that he himself shared with me, and that I'm going to share in this talk in the Azores here in the next few days. And so here's some of some of the books that Pedro was not only published, but also was published in. One of them is the anthology that I published on A Leaf of Blue, that Pedro is kind of responsible for it in many ways, as many other poets are. All the poets are there, of course, are responsible for the anthology on A Leaf of Blue. But when Pedro was here in 2002, I spent a lot of time with him about translating. I was already doing a little bit of translating. And I was actually thinking already of this anthology that actually was published a year later, and showed him a couple of things. And he said this wonderful line: "I'm not a specialist in English, but I think that you're going the right direction." And so it was good to hear that from Pedro da Silveira. Another bit of his of the exhibit. Here he is. And Pedro da Silveira, of course, with some of the books and some of the wonderful exhibit that shows some of the important aspects of his life throughout his lifetime. Beautiful pictures, of course, of the beautiful island of Flores and some of the sunsets. And I'm going to go into another poem. But before I do, wanted to share with you what a good friend of mine and a good friend of the Portuguese American community and a defender of Azorean literature, and that is the literary critic Humberto Freitas, wrote about Pedro da Silveira. It's included in a wonderful book called Poems in Absentia and Poems from the Island and the World. You can buy it in the Azores if you're there, but you can also buy it online. It's available through the various online, including Amazon, and it's published in the Azores by Letras Lavadas, but here by Tagus Press, and the collection, the wonderful collection, Belis Azorica collection, that has, I believe, published 5 books so far, and they're basically all Azorian classics, all Azorian books that are in English, or in this case, bilingual, and doing a grand job. I'm part of the advisory board and very honored to be part of this group, Belis Azorica, that is dedicated to publishing, I believe, a couple of books per year about the Azorian experience, and mainly some of the classics that have been. Of course, they've also published some contemporary ones, such as the wonderful novel by Adelaide Freitas, Smiling in the Darkness. Humberto wrote, and I quote, in the poems collected here, and talking about the poems that Professor George Monteiro, who we'll talk about in just a little bit, also published. He's the one that translated these poems, and they're included in this collection. And he wrote, in the poems collected here, we have some selections from what I've always thought of as Pedro Silveira's most famous book, A Ilha e o Mundo, The Island and the World. There is no doubt that one of these poems, A Ilha, The Island, which Monteiro translated and published originally in The Sea Within, a wonderful anthology that was published in 1983 by Gavia Brown, and gathered a number of Azorian poets and others connected to the islands by different affinities. This corroborates what I have said many times in the interest of Azorian literature in general. These are perhaps the most cited lines of my generation, and he was referring to the poem Ilha by Pedro da Silveira. It must be mere coincidence that one of our greatest poets of all times, and he's referring, of course, to Pedro Silveira, on the most distant archipelago, the closest to America, one of the most limited in terms of material resources for survival, and for this reason, one of the most pragmatic, I believe, of the historical fate of the Azores. The poetry of Pedro da Silveira epitomizes the best of the literary arts of the Azores, his cosmopolitan modernism, his more or less free forms, and especially his themes, which combine the existential and intimate condition of their author with the fury of registering the conditions of our precarious life and consequent protest. His real and metaphorical progress between real and imaginary frontiers became a powerful reference, perhaps even the genesis of all that would be written afterward. The irony of his poetry is also the irony of his literary destiny. I have no doubt that he will be better known and read among those who now have the possibility of absorbing his poetry in English than he will in the rest of Portugal, which recalls little more about the Azores than the anticyclone, and even then knows almost nothing about what this means in meteorological terms. Yet Pedro da Silveira is not only an Azorian poet, he represents, as few others do, a national culture and fate, and he happens to take his islands as the image and metaphor for an entire country, one that claims to be from the sea or turned toward it, but that has already forgotten about the adventure and its living and felt consequences, end quote. And that is part of a wonderful essay that opens up the collection called Pedro da Silveira, Poems in Absentia and Poems from the Island and the World, translated by Professor Jorge Monteiro, the late, unfortunately, Professor Jorge Monteiro from Brown University. And Professor Monteiro also writes, and I'd like to quote with you just to give you a little bit of more of a context of Pedro and what people have said about him. And I quote again, and this time the writing is of Professor Jorge Monteiro, and in an essay that's also included as an afterword in that same book. In a sense, the poet Pedro da Silveira followed the Adam of Genesis. He was not the namer of beasts and flowers and places. He was the discoverer, the verifier, and the conservator of names. He would know the regional name no less than the more generally used name of farming implement or uncommon fruit. And so he actually was one who, and end quote there, he was actually a person who was very interested in bringing these regionalisms of the Azores to a national level and also into international level as well. Pedro da Silveira is the poet that we are paying homage to on this presentation of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University of Fresno. And so a little bit about Pedro as one more poem of Pedro. And again, if you missed this live, and thanks to all those of you who are joining us, but if you missed this live, we will have this archived as we have all of our talks through a couple of different sources. One of them is the Fresno State PBBI YouTube channel. So you can go ahead and, of course, be a part of that and go to Fresno State PBBI, and you'll see the literally hundreds of hours that we have recorded and the hundreds of topics as well. Most of it having to do with the Portuguese diaspora in California, the Azorianists in California, the Azorian spirits, the connections between the Azores and the Valley, poetry, history, panel presentations, testimonials, debates, etc. One of the wonderful poems that actually one could do a master's thesis on, and one could probably even do a PhD dissertation, but certainly a master thesis, is called Exodus, or as you see it there in Portuguese. So I have it there in Portuguese for those who speak Portuguese that can follow along. And I've translated the poem to English. It's included in the anthology On a Leaf of Blue. It will be included in a new anthology that I have called Into the Azorian Sea. And it is one of the poems that hopefully will be part, but hopefully the book will be published if we can find, of course, sponsors and everything else, not my part, just to pay for the book, which is Pathways of Land and Sea, taking about 40 of Pedro da Silveira's poems, dedicated, of course, to the island of Flores and to the immigration. And so here is Exodus in English, and you can follow along in Portuguese. Êxodo. After 30 days of sailing, 30 nights of uncertainty and waiting, we arrived in America. Behind, the last bit of a missed land, and old hunger's screaming desires of leaving. Birds crisscross the sky, and the waves crashed as they came upon the ships of immigration. Sarah, Veronica, Fredonia, Veronica, Dona Maria, at what deep and end of the Atlantic, at what ports did you settle forever? Where are the old men that used to talk to me about the ship of hunger and the shooting ship? Men and women arrived at strange ports, a dream deep within their eyes, and our hunger of breads and of distances stranded the firm land on the other ocean. Only the struggle was ours. When you arrived, there were only rivers and forests and untamed land. San Francisco was still known as Yerba Buena. 800 neighbors, if that, and the tricolor Mexican flag. Sutter and Marshall, if arrived, were much like you, simple colonists. You created whaling stations on the coast, and through the sea, you reached the Bering. Then, throughout the world, spread the gigantic news, and it was the gold rush. Like others, you turned your back to the sea. You bought a large sieve, you bought a pickaxe, and you bought a shovel, and you rose to the Sacramento until the Sierras. Your life was worth a minimum price of a bullet. And you were the 49er. Crossed the continents, went through the Panama, and even went around the Horn. Like you, Yankees arrived, and Mexicans and Indians and Italians and Greeks and Chinese and Germans, Armenians, Jews, white, black, yellow. Cities were born with their businesses, saloons, and dance halls, banks. Sluts of all races civilized your blood. San Francisco grew, putting on the face of a city. And you were a crewman on ferry boats, dock worker, open roads and railroads. You were a sailor, a sheep herder, worked on ranches. You turned wild lands into a paradise. Everywhere, the brand of your steps, from San Diego to Eureka, from Red Bluff to the Sierras, from Monterey to Fresno. Everywhere, the brand of your steps. In the fertile lands of the San Joaquin, in the northern sawmills, in Sonora, Bakersfield, Oakland, everywhere, the brand of your steps, pioneer. For this land that wasn't yours, you gave it the strength of your arms, you gave it your sweat, your skill. For this land that wasn't yours, you gave generously your blood, and you gave it the seeds of all worlds, your sons. Now, with the ports of the entrance closed, the sea is no longer the road of immigrants. It isn't any longer the open road of our clandestine boats. The sea, you said it, George Barbosa, today is our prison without bars. Brothers, let it be. In our islands, we shall build a dream that was refused, our own world. And so that is the wonderful poem called Exodus. And as you can see, it is all over the Azorian experience as far as the immigrant experience as well. The diaspora, the Portuguese diaspora, the Azorian diaspora in North America, whether we're talking about immigrants, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, any immigrant at all. And even if you are the son or the daughter of an immigrant, grandson or granddaughter, great grandson or granddaughter, any, indeed, it is worth reading the poetry of Pedro da Silveira, because as you can see, and some of these poems were written in 1940s and 50s and 60s. And so as you can see, that the Azorian history is tied to the Azorian immigration, to the news coming from America and then later on Canada to the Azores. But his poetry is not just of the recent immigrant, or that is that immigrant that came in the 19, such as myself, the Exodus pós Capelinhos. So the immigrant that came in the 1960s and 70s and even early 80s. Pedro goes into the immigrants that came in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And that is the first true big wave of immigration. He even goes back before that. He even goes into those who left, such as his in his own family, those who left in the 1840s and 50s, and those who came on whaling ships, and then those who came across the land basically to, of course, be looking for gold in the gold rush. So it is part of the history of the Azores, and it is wonderful that Pedro da Silveira was able to bring this to the forefront. Many reasons to commemorate Pedro da Silveira, but certainly the most important one is to commemorate him as a poet that understood that the Azorianness or the Azorian spirit or the Azorian experience, or to be an Azorian, is also to be a Californian and to be a New Englander and to be a Canadian of the East or the West Coast and to be a Brazilian as the first immigrants that went to Brazil as well, and some of the families and others on their own later on as well. And so, my dear friends, it was a pleasure to bring this to you. The island always within you, commemorating the centennial of Pedro da Silveira. here as part of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, PBBI, from California State University, Fresno, as also with the collaboration, of course, of the Cagajo Colloquium and Bruma Publications, and the sponsorship that we are always very thankful to the Luso-American Development Foundation that is FLAD from Lisbon, Portugal. Here's a little bit about the Cagajo Colloquium, which is a of Azorian writers. And again, our thanks to FLAT, the Luso-American Development Foundation, for obviously being a sponsor of our Portuguese Oral History Project of Fresno State, and being a sponsor of the conference and lecture series as well. Again, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing this and thanking you all for being part of what we do here at Fresno State. Thanking you for your presence, and it is a pleasure to be here and to present this to you. And thank you all for joining us, whether you're here or whether you are also joining us, as many of you are on Facebook. I thank all of you for your comments. I'm going to end with another poem from Pedro called Last West. The land ends here, beyond is only sea and wind. The land ends here, with it all that I intend. Sometimes I imagine myself leaving a harbor where my destiny begins, but that's just foolishness. Until when? Greenwood and a fire, and dream. Each dream is summed up. On behalf of the on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno, I thank you for joining us as we commemorated the 100th birthday of poet Pedro da Silveira. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you on the next event of PBBI from Fresno State. We announce, of course, through our mailing list that we have of over 550 people. If you'd like to be part of that, send us an email to dborges@mail.fresnostate.edu. Again, dborges @mail.fresnostate.edu, and we can put you on that list as well. And also, of course, through the various social media platforms. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure to talk to you a little bit about Pedro da Silveira, a wonderful poet that needs to be known by all who are Azorian, of course, and those who aren't Azorian, those who just like a good poem. I want to share with you the book, just to see the picture of the book that I mentioned, where some of his poems are already translated. This is the one that was done in published by Letras Lavadas in São Miguel. The cover of the one that was done here by Tagus Press is a little bit different, but it's a wonderful book, and it shows a lot of the poetry translated to English of Pedro da Silveira, the ones related to immigration and the ones not related to immigration. The book that I'd like to put together are the ones that are with immigration, and basically there are quite a few of them, and some that may seem not to be, but they are about the immigrant experience, about the experience of, as I said, and to repeat, because I think we don't repeat it enough, it is, you can be an Azorian, whether you live in the 9 beautiful islands of the Azores, or whether you live in the hot San Joaquin Valley, at least this week, the very hot San Joaquin Valley of California, or you live anywhere else in California, New England, Canada, Brazil. The Azorian spirit is well and alive throughout the world. Again, take care, everyone. On behalf of the PBBI Fresno State, we thank you for being with us. Take care.